Now, I'm joined by the former head of the Foreign Office, Lord McDonald. He worked with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary, and he has been, or was, a Mandarin for nearly 4 decades. So you know a bit about what goes on under the bonnet, Lord McDonald. Thanks for coming on the show. The evidence today, there were so many revelations about what was going on at the heart of government. It spoke overwhelmingly to dysfunction, messages that were always meant to be private now revealed. Were you surprised? Were you dismayed?
A bit of both. I mean, what we've seen today is unedifying. I mean, the innermost workings of government are never uplifting. Our private conversations are meant to be private, but when they are in an official context, of course, they are discoverable. The inquiry has asked to see all these quite properly, and they make grisly reading.
Did you have some sympathy for some of your former colleagues, senior civil servants that are now having to give evidence that you thought, there, for the grace of God go I, would I want my private messages revealed in this way?
Yes and no. Yes, because they were under enormous pressure. And this was the biggest crisis that we'd faced for a century in public health. And clearly we were not prepared. So getting on top of it, getting ahead of it was an enormous challenge. And we took longer than we should. And that is evidence from today's evidence. But the reason why I temper that is that the first advice I ever had joining the Foreign Office was don't write anything down that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the Daily Mail. And all of this breaches that very basic principle I learned 40 odd years ago.
And on that, and I want to come on to some of the sort of remarks about Boris Johnson in those messages, but before we do, on that matter, disappearing messages, what do you think of Martin Reynolds turning on disappearing messages?
WhatsApp is still quite new technology. It takes some time for government to decide how to handle these technologies for the permanent record. So I don't know what the protocols were in early 2020, but I can believe that government had not promulgated the policies.
Would you use disappearing messages yourself? Do you think he shouldn't have done that?
I think, yes, I agree. He should not, and I think he said the same today.
But he didn't really explain why he did. He said, I don't really know. I mean, a guy that senior knows what he's doing and why.
I certainly can't read myself into his head if he can't remember. But as I say, people were under tremendous pressure and they weren't quite sure what was properly private.
I mean, just on that, just before we move on, just in terms of, do you think we should even have government by WhatsApp? I know this is kind of a side, maybe it's not a side issue. I mean, what do you think is one of the lessons from this, that government communication should not be done over WhatsApp, or is the horse bolted on that?
No, my conclusion is the reverse. I think it cannot be disinvented, so it should be explicit to everybody with an official phone that everything on that phone is for the permanent record, and they work in that knowledge.
And just in terms of what Simon Case wrote to Dominic Cummings in WhatsApps, he said of Boris Johnson, I'm at the end of my tether. He changes strategic direction every day. He cannot lead and we cannot support him in leading with this approach. He said the team captain cannot change the call on the big plays every day. He said government isn't actually that hard, but this guy is making it impossible. Is that familiar to you?
It was about the most awkward thing. The only thing that completely staggers me is his belief that government is not that hard. I think government is actually very hard. Clearly, the atmosphere, the working relationships, the new structures in Number 10 made things much more difficult.
But Lord McDonald, this guy is the head. He's the most senior Mandarin in government. I mean, you must have been surprised by the tone of that, huh?
Yes. I've not spoken to him for a long time, but I am confident that he regrets saying that.
And do you think it damages the reputation of the civil service?
I don't know that it damages the reputation of the civil service, but it certainly damages relations between senior civil servants and ministers. There is confidence that is essential to doing business at the top of government. And when that confidence breaks down, then clearly the system seizes up.
There's a bigger question here, isn't there, as well, Lord McDonald, that there's a question about whether the machine wasn't tooled up for this sort of crisis. Was this a structural problem about the machinery of government, or was it a personnel issue about who was running Downing Street and what the bandwidth was or the management style was?
I think it was both. But one of the features of the Johnson number 10 was a supercharged chief of staff. And this was a man new to government, so learning government, but incredibly powerful. Dominic Cummings. And so he was learning the job whilst being the second most powerful person in the country. And we see the consequences of that in today's evidence.
Well, how did you find your dealings with him, Dominic Cummings?
I had very few because my lane was foreign policy. But what I remember is that he was in lots of meetings in the background, very rarely contributing, but present, and everybody else present was aware of his presence.
But just to sort of stay on this for a second, do you think that that undermines Simon Case? Because should an unelected chief of staff be, as you say, the second most powerful person in government?
Well, I think it certainly complicated things because in number 10 you had not only a chief of staff, you also had the principal private secretary and you had the cabinet secretary next door. So how they interacted was not always clear, the job descriptions weren't clear, and the personal relationships clearly weren't working as they need to.
So the system's not fit for purpose?
At that point, I think the evidence is now pretty overwhelming. But I think, as we're discussing, it's personalities as well as structures. And some of the structures were particular to Prime Minister Johnson.
And I've got to wrap, but just one final thought, Lord McDonald. What is, for you, the main lesson to be learnt from this?
There's so many. We've got to be more disciplined. We've got to be disciplined about the structures, about our priorities, and we have to have the right people in these key jobs.
Lord McDonald, thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. Invaluable to get your insight. Thank you for joining us on the Politics Hub.